Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional Facebook page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can also find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The information shared on this program is informational and should not be considered therapy. This podcast addresses many topics around mental health and sexuality and may not be suitable for minors. Some topics may elicit a trigger or emotional response, so please care for yourself accordingly. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer Podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes is by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode on the Natasha Helfer Podcast, where we attack shame any way we can get to it. And I'm super excited for today's podcast guest because it's Erika Nordfelt, and she wrote a book all about attacking shame. It's called Don't Walk Alone, Understanding the Divine Gift of Connection While Navigating Shame. I'm going to get more into that here in a minute, but I wanted to make a few announcements. At Symmetry Counseling, in my group practice, we have a lot of groups starting in the new year. One on dating, one on ethical non-monogamy, one on healing from male sexual shame. And then I have a ketamine group for reclaiming female sexuality that's going to be a one-day event on, I want to say it's January 25th. If I'm remembering it, I should have the calendar in front of me. That would be smart. Yes, January 25th. And the early bird special for that ends this Sunday. So if you're interested, sign up now so we can get you in there. You can still sign up after this week, but obviously if I can save you some money, that's a good deal. So anyway, that's a little bit of what's going on with me. If you want to check out more of what's going on with my events, it's either natashahelfer.com or simcounseling.com. We can get your answers. All right. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker, our interviewee today. Erika, you graduated with your BS in counseling in 2009 from Adams State College. And since then, you've been working primarily in a clinical space with individuals and couples. You started at the university level working with college students and loved that. So a lot of emerging adults. In 2020, you started your own private practice, and now you're the owner and clinical director of the group practice called Greenstone Counseling. And you have two offices in Rexburg and Picatello. So you're serving kind of that larger Southeast Idaho area. You specialize in trauma. You do a lot of direct work with LGBTQ plus clients and clients questioning, leaving, or having left high demand religions. It sounds like you're right in the same line of work that I'm in. You use EMDR and IFS techniques in your approach. And you wrote a book, like I said, Don't Walk Alone, and which covers a lot of just important mental health concepts overlaid with spirituality, shame resilience, and connection. And you run your practice with your husband, Brady, and you have 4 kiddos, a dog, a cat, and you like to play outside whenever and wherever you can. Is that fair? Is that a good intro?
Yes, that's great. That's grand. Awesome.
All right. So, Erika, I read over your book today. Believe it or not, I actually had time to do that. I just got it yesterday. I was like, come on, Amazon, send it to me quicker.
It's Christmas. They're busy. Poor Amazon.
Right? Well, I don't know if I would ever say poor Amazon, but
yes, this is true.
Poor Amazon workers.
Yes. Yes.
But anyway, right off the bat, you caught my interest with the intro or the prologue. I don't know what you call it, whatever this is. The
intro? I think it's an intro. The beginning part before chapter 1.
Because right away you talk about a dilemma you had. It's kind of like in writing this book, I don't know if it was because you were writing this book or just a lot of other things that were happening in your life, you kind of found yourself going through a transition yourself. So I would love to start there and tell us about kind of what that process was like.
That's grand to start there because it really was quite the dilemma. I started writing this book. It probably took 2+ years, maybe 3 from very beginning to publication, which I know is pretty classic for books. But in that span, I went from being very orthodox LDS practicing. I think at the time I was Young Women's president for the second time, and actually I got a prompting. I maybe view it a little bit differently, but at the time I really felt inspired to write this book at a Time Out for Women conference, which, for those that don't know, Time Out for Women is a very popular kind of speaking event. They have speakers, they have music, they have products. It's quite the commercial, but they, kind of travel the nation and put on like this event for a lot of women. And I went with some family members, and it was actually grand. I enjoyed it. But in that, I was noticing a lot of the speakers like had these books or products, and I wasn't a musical person. So I was like, I'm not going to write anything musical, but I was like, I felt like I should write a book, like I had something to say. So that was kind of the impetus of it. And a lot of what I was wanting to say was what I was seeing show up in work. At the time, I had probably been practicing, I don't know, maybe 8 years or so. I had been in therapy. I actually practiced initially. Well, I graduated, took a couple years off for children and more babies. And then my husband and I moved to Rexburg. And so I actually started practicing therapy at BYU Idaho. I was at the counseling center there. So not only was my life very surrounded by a lot of LDS-ness, so was my work, because on campus, everyone has to have an ecclesiastical endorsement in order to be attending. And so I was working with all LDS students, which was great. And I loved that work, but it was also influencing how I saw shame overlap religion, overlap sexuality, overlap just couples work in general. Like it was hard to not see it all over the place. So I kind of started writing this book. I had and have an incredible sister that's an editor. Actually, she works for Forbes magazine right now. And she was like, I'll help you with this project. She was a super big cheerleader, because you hit these walls of like imposter syndrome and do I really have anything to say, as well as like writing isn't fun for me. I never like went about, I just want to be a writer. I know how to, I successfully can write things, but it's not like it was my passion. So she helped me push through a lot of those walls and be able to kind of make it to the other side. And so here I am, years in the making of this book. At the time, it was very centered around mental health, shame, and specifically LDS gospel topics. Like it was kind of my vision was being able to help people see these aspects of what we see as professionals as healthy through gospel doctrine. Also, a lot of work of Brene Brown and shame resilience and all of that was in there. And at the time, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. That scripture means this. Or, mindfulness is just praying. We do that anyways. And so I was kind of creating this marriage, I think, of those concepts. But as life proceeded, some of that doctrine was breaking down, as well as, I have a whole personal story around what happened with my deconstruction. But I got to the other side of things, having finished the book, having found a publisher, and recognizing like I couldn't honestly represent what I wrote at that point, being very close to out. I wasn't, but I was a PMO. Like I was mostly just like I knew I didn't believe anymore. It wasn't honest for me to say I totally support all that I wrote in this. Even I'll be honest, it was great. Like I almost wanted to be like, can someone else pretend it was their book? Because I'm sure it'll help a whole lot of people. Like it was kind of cool to see how things were linked into Mormon doctrine, and I knew it would resonate with a lot of people. But I couldn't be in line with my own integrity and say, this is what I want to put out there, because it's not necessarily the author that I am anymore. Mm-hmm. So my publisher was awesome. And I, wrote them an email kind of explaining where I was at. And they said, we'll give you a timeline if you feel like you want to edit and kind of adapt it however you want to. We're totally willing to still print for you, which was great. So I did that. I kind of made it more of a spiritual. There's definitely still a lot of Christian tones, which I hope isn't off-putting to too many people, because I also quote Buddha and Maya Angelou and Brene Brown and all of these very other, wise humans. So it doesn't have to just strictly be Christian theology, but it's still, I'm pretty sure I still talk about Jesus a lot. And I'm a big fan of Jesus. He's got some great content, I would say. So they were great to let me rewrite it and publish it. And that's kind of as it is today. A lot of good ideas around mental health coping and self-care and yes, shame resilience, a lot of the stuff that you talked about, but it's no longer directly just tied to Mormon doctrine.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so maybe let's dig into that a little bit, because I remember too, when I was more obviously within the construct of my Mormon upbringing as well, was definitely had a lot of those similar ideas, right? Like on the one hand, loving my faith community, loving a lot of the doctrinal things that I had grown up with. And I think this might resonate with lots of people, regardless of the religious upbringing they maybe come from, is like there's a lot of things there that you love and that you feel deeply about. And you start seeing some of the problems. Like, I mean, you write in your book a whole chapter on perfectionism, and you write a whole chapter on shame. And the reality is that a lot of the things that are happening in those religious constructs are pushing perfectionism and are pushing, unfortunately, some shame kinds of results. And so how do you start making sense of that? And what kinds of issues would you say, especially working with a more conservative or LDS clientele, and especially in Idaho, I know that that's a fairly conservative kind of school that a lot of people go to.
We will say.
Yeah, like what kinds of themes did you notice start to show up that were, in my mind, what I started calling was unnecessary tragedy? Like life is hard enough without us having to add to the kit and caboodle of shame and perfectionism.
Yeah. So shame was definitely the beginning of it. That it was like, oh man, I had, I don't know, discovered Brene Brown years and years ago, but somewhat early in my work, and it just like spoke straight to my heart. And so I just resonated with her as a human, and I loved that. And I would sometimes use some of her work or research, or recommend some of her books in practice. So that was already just something that I felt like was useful for mental health wellness. But as I'm describing what shame is and the difference between shame and guilt, and how people see that show up in their lives, it was everywhere, especially when it came to sexuality. I shouldn't say it's only there, because perfectionism can take all sorts of different flavors, and so can shame. But there was an especially high, I would say, just quantity of sexual shame that was just really, really hard to not see everywhere. And it overlapped with my life personally too. At a certain point, my husband, was discussed with me how he struggled. I'm using quotations for those that can't know, because I really don't adhere to these terms anymore, but struggled with like pornography and the way we handled that and experienced that was very classic and typical to how I saw a lot of other clients, as well as how I have seen things not be handled well. I've evolved a lot as a clinician since then. And in our marriage, things have been, evolving a lot better. And yet, so at a certain point, it's like, okay, I was seeing so much of this shame, and I was trying to approach it to the best of my experience and to best of my knowledge, concepts that would help. And things weren't getting better. And at the time, I wasn't as trauma trained as I am now. I use a lot of EMDR and IFS, which is incredible, and it helps so much with those things. But I didn't have those skills as a clinician, and it was mostly just talk therapy. And it was like we were just hitting these walls of where shame was so loud and so immovable, and everything else they were doing, they were still really putting efforts into these other areas, but like the shame wasn't budging. And as I continued to practice and even can be creative and try different approaches, I was like, nothing's working. Nothing is actually helping them feel better. And so I started to zoom out, and I was like, this is a systemic problem. I couldn't unsee that it was much larger than just the humans. It was coming from a larger message around it, even for some when they were very, very young. And that's not even just, a hit at the Mormon church. It's similar patterns show up in all sorts of other conservative cultures or religions. There was a podcast I listened to once about, oh gosh, and now I'm forgetting what the religion is. They're so much like us. It was almost like you're saying all the same things. Evangelicals. And so it was these two gentlemen who are actually really large. Rhett and Link. I don't know if you've heard of them on Good Mythical Morning. They have a whole YouTube channel. Anyways, they had their own religious deconstruction and kind of going over their experience, and they were talking about the how ashamed they were that they were looking at pornography, and they had these like posters on their wall that said, "Don't you look at all," and then under his pillow was like, Playboy or something like that. And I was like, that's boy ever. So like I was seeing some of these conservative messages in different pockets of humanity that weren't working, and that were contributing actually to these behaviors that we somewhat demonize or make evil of, and say that that's the problem, or the product is the problem, it's porn, versus wait a minute, like let's zoom out, let's back up and see where this is all going awry, because it's going awry way before any behaviors show up. Like there is no permission to just be human, whether that's an imperfect human or a sexual human or whatever. That was a lot of the problem as well. And of course, we also see though that there's messages that are in contrast to that. God loves you anyways. You don't have to be perfect. The atonement is incredible. So there's a lot of that messaging going on, but what's internalized doesn't seem to be that message. There were so many missionaries, and even still I work with them, and I would ask questions like, is that really how you feel about all people, that they have to be perfect in a certain way in order to be good enough for God? Because these were the things they were telling me. Is that how you feel about, your friends or your partners or the people you taught on your mission? And they were like, oh, absolutely not. Absolutely not. But they were the one exception in the whole world that, because they'd internalized that shame, that they actually had to live up to something different, but no one else did. So it's very confusing, very complex. And that was a really long answer to your question.
That's so true, though. I mean, these are complicated answers because they're complicated things. So I guess one of the things I'd like for you to reflect upon with us is why is it that if we have the messages around forgiveness and, the atonement or repentance or don't judge other people, the kind of benevolent type of messages in a lot of these religions, why is it that so often instead we do internalized focus on but I'm not good enough, after all I can do, I need to, be better. What do you think that's about?
That's such a good question. And I probably will have a really good answer, like once we're done here, and be like, dang it, I should have said that.
How my brain works.
The top of my head. So in my work, I've become, again, far more trauma focused. Mm-hmm. And I can't help but look back at, like, as children or as teens, we're still very malleable, and we're still very susceptible to internalize messages quicker than we would as adults. So I feel like the contrast in this is how you feel, this is what you should do, and this is what you shouldn't do. The shouldn't do has such a hard quality to it that it is possibly a bit traumatic. And that trauma leaves an imprint. So as a little kid, or again, even as a teenager, I looked at something and I knew I wasn't supposed to, and my body had this whole reaction to it. And that my response to what happened was very traumatic, and that like stuck with me, that it just goes deep, and the body learns, now I need to feel shame to those concepts or behaviors or whatever it is. And that repeats over and over again. But Natasha, I'm totally curious how you would answer that question, because that's a good question. Yeah, well, why do we
I agree that I do think harsher things stick more than compliments. In fact, that's kind of some of the parental advice we're doling out these days is, for every one criticism or every one correction, give like 10 compliments, because we are wired to notice things that are harsh or dangerous or potentially a threat more than we are wired to notice the things that are floofy and fun and nice. So I think that's one reason. I do think the other reason, though, is I do want to come back to the system itself, because the system is offering a consequence or a fear that is quite catastrophic.
Yeah.
Right. This is not like, oh, well, if you watch porn, you're kind of naughty and you should probably do better. It's like, if you watch porn, that will potentially not allow you to spend your eternities with your family, and, kind of the hell and damnation type of rhetoric that is shared in different language, I guess, depending on the religious background. But there is a fairly big consequence. And I think when I have taken more of a critical lens to listening to a lot of the talks and speeches that we, at least in LDS land, receive, the emphasis is much more on how we are lacking and how we need to improve than ever on how we're already okay, or we're doing well and the Lord is pleased with us. Usually the messages are about how we're not doing well and how we need to do better. So I think that there's several reasons there that are happening. They're both systemic and also just kind of individual wiring. Is that fair? Would you?
Yeah, totally. And not only is it that it'll ruin your life, if you'll also be denied blessings. So, because sometimes it's not, I keep using the sexual references because they're just easy to think of, but maybe we'll go with the perfectionism that I have to be perfect. And here I am, like a 35-year-old female that's single and doesn't have kids. Well, I'm going to internalize that's because I haven't been righteous enough. Mm-hmm. So it's still on me because I'm going to be denied. There's a lot of emphasis on how good we aren't. And if we are good, what we're going to get too, like you're saying. And so the inverse becomes the message. If I'm not getting what I've been promised, something must be defective with me, which is interesting because that's actually very young way to internalize messages. Children do that all the time just to make sense of their lives. If I'm getting beat, it's because I'm not a good enough daughter or whatever. But that's not a very that's not the full picture. That's just the child's brain trying to make sense of their life and their environment. And yet as adults, we get stuck in those. Again, it feels so like you're just trying to make sense of it. And we internalize shame as a response to make sense of what's going on.
Well, and a lot of these cultures are kind of an ongoing relationship with kind of like an infantilized version of ourselves. Like, I would say one of my biggest critiques of my experience in the Mormon church is that it didn't matter what age I was kind of consistently treated as a teenager. I still had to go in and confess sins, to like a father figure. I still had to improve. I still had to, and we don't treat like 60-year-old single people any different than we treat 14-year-old people in regards to sexual allowance to be able to even touch your own body, let's say, and masturbate. Yeah. So there is this kind of like ongoing relationship with a younger kind of developmental stage than I think is appropriate for most adults, which happens in enmeshed, kind of systems that expect you to be loyal to the system versus your own inner kind of self-determination.
Yes. And I also still feel like that is kind of the impetus of a lot of distress. Because sometimes their inner intuition is telling them something that is in contrast to what they're supposed to be relying on from this outside authority. Man, that is overwhelmingly distressing. I mean, that's cognitive dissonance, but it's like, wait, if that's not me, who is that? And then they're told that that's Satan versus like, no, actually, maybe that's wisdom or that's something that makes sense that's coming from your own value system, your own core self. But there isn't permission for that. They have to rely on those outside authorities, whether those are deities or actual humans, or even, patriarchy within a family, that they are not able to really develop that own sense of self. And a sense of self is really shame resilient. It's incredible. That's what helps us feel like we are good enough anyways, when we can truly tap in with who we feel like we are.
Yeah, Right. Yeah. No, I think it's an interesting ethical dilemma. I was, even as an LDS therapist, I remember telling a lot of my clients when they were kind of facing these dilemmas, right? Of like, well, do I do the thing that is correct, or do I do the thing that would be more useful or that would bear more fruit? As an example, I'm trying to think of like a couple, it was very typical for me to meet with a couple where maybe a heterosexual couple where the female was maybe anorgasmic. And some of the things that we know that can help are sex toys or masturbation or erotica to help kind of bring about the stimulation. And so that then they'd be in a dilemma. Well, do we do something that will help us have a better sex life and that we're kind of interested in? Or does that mean that we're sinning and doing something that we should feel guilty about? So one of the things I would say oftentimes is, well, isn't it interesting that even though we don't allow for much nuance in our practice, every single scriptural story that I'm aware of, the only reason why it's interesting and probably in the quote unquote scriptures is because there's an ethical dilemma where they have to do something that kind of goes against the grain, right? Whether it's something as serious as murder or something less serious like lying, or even laying by the feet, which quite frankly means having sex with a certain person, or whatever those things are. Like those stories are interesting because people are having to face that kind of growth and development of, well, do I do what everybody's telling me I should do, or do I do what's actually going to help me in this situation?
Yeah. And so seeing clients go through that of like, how do I make sense of this is very difficult, as well as I was kind of going about some of that myself. Like, wait a minute, see things differently.
As was I. Okay, so you lay out, in the book, you lay out kind of like you're saying, a shame resilience plan or idea. And you start with something that I think is really important, is connection. And of course, along with that goes vulnerability and a lot of other things that you mentioned throughout the book. So can you start us off with kind of giving us a brief description of what is the equation for shame resilience development?
Okay, abbreviation without going into all of it. Again, some of this is pretty compatible, whether it's piggybacking off or evolving from work we see just in psychology, a lot of Brene Brown's work, but just how as humans, we are pairing creatures, and we are not, nor have we ever throughout centuries of time done well in isolation. Like we do better when we have meaningful connections. It's not enough to just survive like in a tribe. What I'm talking about is meaningful connection where you feel seen and heard and validated. So this is concepts of vulnerability, again, Brene Brown stuff, or empathy, because what empathy does is it helps someone feel like they're not alone. The most convincing and damaging part of shame is that we're alone. And that no one will really understand what we're feeling, or that we should be alone. So then we isolate ourselves away from opportunities to maybe think contrary to that or feel compassion from other people. And yet, again, when I was first starting this book, I was thinking mostly of connection with others, because in religion, there's a lot of relational focus on that, either with partners or family or God, all these relationships with different humans or deities. And yet I think that can be so much broader than that. Connection with self can also be extremely meaningful and shame resilient when it's an acceptance of like, I love you anyways, and I'm so sorry you're going through this. That's self-compassion work from Kristen Neff and other, branches of psychology that help us recognize not only does that help us improve with our mental health, soothe our nervous system. That there's real research on how that helps us feel so much better when we can be more compassionate to ourselves and be more connected to ourselves. And yet we can also be connected to nature. Or just to kind of life at large. There's great meaning in those types of experiences too that help us feel possibly less alone, even though you might be all the way alone in the middle of, some mountain scene. But there's meaning and there's a value in being alive amongst life or nature or something beautiful or something grander than yourself. So when I talk about connection, it is that connection with something else where there is meaning, and yet utilizing that opportunity to create healing. So just because we can connect doesn't mean we are good at it, especially when shame shows up. We actually rather suck at that because we feel like we are not enough. That's kind of the definition of shame. It's not that something bad happened or we did something bad. It's that we are something bad. And so that carrying that identity is really, really embarrassing or shame oriented to share with another person. And yet with the right other people, the very opposite can be the result of like, it's actually okay. It's actually okay. Maybe I'm not worthless. I still kind of feel like I am, but because I shared that with you and you shared love with me, I feel like maybe that's a lie. So it's taking those steps towards believing better messages about ourselves. And with God too, like I can't deny that people do have a lot of meaningful healing experiences if they do feel connection to some type of higher power, whether it's an actual deity or something else. There can create a lot of meaning in those things. So that's kind of what I'm starting out with of somewhat setting this mission out for people to recognize connection is really good for us. We seek it out anyways. So seek it out on purpose, especially when you're hurting, because it'll help you.
Right, right. Well, if you don't mind, and I asked you permission to talk about this, well, you talk about it in the book, so we're going to talk about it more. I'd like to kind of use an example, which I thought was really awesome of you to share personal examples. That makes it much more, I think, applicable for folks when they're reading a book and there's personal examples instead of just a lot of theory. And so you shared an experience where you and your husband went through what I call the classic pornography dilemma that is oftentimes happening within our culture and of course others, where your husband came to you and shared that he had been looking at porn or masturbating or whatever he did. And then you supposedly took care of it as a couple. And then years later, he came back and said, actually, I've been having the problem all along. And that was, devastating to you in that moment to recognize. So I'd like for you just to talk about that, because I like to use that as an example of how you use some of these concepts that you're talking about in the book to kind of heal from that perspective. So can you just maybe set up the story better than I'm setting it up?
Oh, you're doing a great job. And yet some people might not understand what those classic experiences are. So I'll give a little bit more detail. Yeah, like we had been married, oh gosh, a while, more than 5 years or something like that. And at a certain point, I think he had expressed it was an issue before we had got married, but it wasn't really something I thought about or worried about. And then yet, for whatever reason, he came and yeah, opened up about it. And the initial time, and I'll give myself some pats on the back that I feel like I handled it pretty well. I had some therapy skills at that point to learn how to have good conversations and not just jump to my own dysregulated emotions and miss an opportunity to be there for my partner whom I loved, because it was a very vulnerable share. So I believe, and he might tell this totally different, but it was a hard conversation, but it was like, okay, now we know, now we can handle it and all is well. And I naively proceeded forward, as well as he probably did, of like, great, we did the thing. What maybe people don't understand though is there is so much messaging around sexual imagery, around masturbation, around solo sex type things that this is contrary to a marital relationship, that you're going to like spiral or snowball into more deviant behaviors. You can no longer enjoy, sexual experiences with your wife, like a lot of these big, scary messages. And so when it so much shows up in your marriage without me knowing, of course, I'm going to jump to these like, that's terrifying. We're working so hard to build something beautiful. And that seems to be the opposite of what we're building. Mm-hmm. But we kind of weathered that storm. And then, yes, however many years later, he says, yeah, I've actually still been. And that was what was the more crushing confession. I don't like that term, though, because I had felt like, yeah, he actually hadn't been honest with me. And that is so classic. Why would he be honest with me? Because it crushed my world. I remember driving to work and I was trying so hard I couldn't even drive anymore. I had to pull over. I wasn't safe on the road because I had just felt like this massive amount of betrayal. And not to like belittle what people feel as betrayal, like that was very real for me, but it was somewhat curated for me to feel that way and to feel betrayed without having a larger knowledge of the dysfunction of it all. Like, when he's going to break my heart every time he's telling me this, and he loves me so much, like, of course he's going to hold that back, because that's so painful. And it's already painful maybe for enough for him to carry that. So people get stuck in this system where actually deceit is an easier option. And yet it just makes it more confusing and painful when they do, as well as the idea that you have to actually confess every single time. That turns one partner into a warden, the other one into an inmate. Like, that's not sexy. That's not great for intimacy or any of those things. But we didn't know that. We were just kind of going off of what we had thought this is like the way forward.
Right.
So from there, we actually got involved with the church's 12-step groups, which at the time, and this actually is pretty compatible with concepts around shame resilience, because vulnerability, when we really show up in our honest self with the right people, again, that's healing, that can help us feel like we're not alone. And so these programs, which still exist, and I have very different feelings about the programs now, but at the time, it was a place where we could go. There was a group for the men, and then there was a group for the wives, because it was classically the men had the problem and the wives were the silent sufferers, we would say. But it was a place where we could go and open up and deal with these issues with people that understood it. And it felt pretty healing initially to be able to be surrounded by people that were not judgmental and were able to understand us on a better level. And that's actually the beauty of groups. That's why therapy groups are still something people do all over the place. That's why you're doing so many of them. They have an incredible quality that helps people feel connected. So that helped us, but it wasn't like it helped the problem. It wasn't the cure for porn and masturbation, because the way we were approaching it was still aiming at complete abstinence from that, and yet living in sexual bodies and around in lives with sexual stimulus everywhere. And so the approach didn't actually help, but we felt a little bit better after, when we came home from those nights. And yet looking back, it's like, wow, we committed so much time to that. And it was seemingly this idea of like, this is what will help you get through. This is where God will promise you and he will bless you through your trials. And it did feel better, but we sacrificed so much to go to those groups. We had, 1 to 2 kids in the midst of that. We were both in grad school. Like, our evenings were very valuable time, whether it was to spend as a family or to do homework. And we were dedicating so much time to go to these groups with the idea that it would help us or fix it. And it didn't, actually. It didn't, because the approach was problematic. And yet that's all we knew how to do until we learned more and grew and, we're able to attach different value to different things and see things differently, which, I can go there too. But up at this point, it was like we were just trying our hardest and still having the cycle meaning that, hey, we're doing good. And then he confesses, no, he's not actually doing good, or he kind of had a slip. Again, I'm putting these in quotations for those that can't see, because this is very addiction model language, that you had a slip, or you were sober for a while, now you're not sober anymore. It's not accurate language. But then it's like, oh, here we go again. This is just so hard. You can't get over it. Maybe it's because I'm not enough as a wife, or you're just not righteous enough, or you're not being honest because you really do want to do it, which is actually kind of part of the truth. But that's, we can normalize that. We can normalize that instead of shame it. And shame perpetuates all of it, because it's hard to carry. And what helps with this shame that's hard, maybe a behavior that gives you a little bit of relief. And so I'm going to engage and have an orgasm, which is fantastic. All sorts of wonderful brain chemicals. And then right after that, I feel, okay, wait, I'm worthless again, and depressed and sad or anxious. So I feel like I'm rambling a bit. Reel me back in, Natasha.
Oh, it is. It's such a we could do a 3-hour podcast just on this topic alone. I'm asking you to talk about this because I do think it's a good example of how shame propagates itself and actually becomes part of the problem. And unfortunately, a lot of the solutions are, and so I'm putting solutions into quoting marks because basically the solution that the religion offers is control your behavior. If you control your behavior, you will then not have a problem. And so again, if these groups don't work, it's not that there's something wrong with the model or the group. There's something wrong, again, with you, which exacerbates this shame, which then, as you do well in the book to explain, is that shame will beget usually more problematic behavior instead of less. And when you're at war with a behavior that's as strong as like something tied to your sexual, drive and your sexual kind of impulses and things of that nature, now we're cinephising, that's a word I like to make up, we're cinephising kind of natural human tendencies and creating kind of a story and, a whole kind of community event, around this thing where people play certain roles. And you're correct that we gender these roles. Like the man is the one who's sexual and the woman is the one who is the warden per se. And it was interesting because even throughout my LDS experience, there were times that the female came in as the one who had the porn quote unquote issue. Mm-hmm. And the reaction often, not always, but often was very different. It was kind of like, wow, you're interested in this, and wait a minute, can we do this? Even with LDS folks, right? So it was so interesting that when the issue was on the other foot per se, in regards to the gender, the response wasn't as curated by the community. And so they were kind of free to have their own responses because nobody was telling them how to respond to that particular issue per se. And oftentimes it was much more playful and fun than obviously the other way around. So, I really appreciate what you said about the groups, because I have heard this a lot from folks that have come in, is that the groups initially were helpful. Mm-hmm. And I agree. I think it has all to do with this piece of connection that you are talking about. It's connective. You don't feel alone. You are able to share vulnerability, which in of itself has its own brain chemicals. And so people, walk away from that feeling hopeful and not isolated. And so of course that's going to feel better until again, it kind of doesn't. And then you're having to figure out, well, why isn't this working long-term? I guess other things I want you to maybe speak of as we're kind of nearing somewhat the end of this interview is like, well, then how does this tie to other concepts that you talk about the book? And I think the two that I'm wanting you to focus on right now is self-awareness and also just allowing for humanity. That was a chapter I'm not sure if that's exactly what you called it, but something about being human. How did those two concepts help both you and your husband walk away from this with a better model?
That's good questions. And I feel like I have to pull out my book and say, what did I say? I'm sure it was so great. I don't know if I remember where I talked about humanity. But self-awareness,
the chapter was common humanity, by the way.
Common humanity. Okay. So that was actually taking a bit from Kristen Neff's self-compassion research. She calls about common human. So yes. Okay. My memory's jogged. I'll get there. With self-awareness though, I mean, this is a very mindfulness concept, but I also talk to clients about like, has to be your first step. You have to pay attention to what's going on in your life, what's going on in your body, what's going on with your emotions before anything can shift anywhere. Not that it always has to. Sometimes that ability to be self-aware can actually have a pretty healing quality. Mindfulness in general can decrease suffering a lot when we talk about it. And again, self-awareness isn't totally mindfulness. That's a bit more complex of a concept, but they are compatible in the ways of paying attention to what's going on with me. So like when I'm talking to clients about shame, like what does shame feel like? And they'll tell me maybe stories and I'll say, great. Okay. Also, what does it feel like in your body? Where do you feel it? What sensations are going on? The somatic response in our bodies is so very intuitive and informational. Like anxiety for me is all right here in my, totally in my neck and in my shoulders, and I get tight. And then there's this, for those that can't see, there's like a jitteriness in my chest. That's what anxiety feels like for me. And our bodies often are responding to whatever is going on in our lives before we're even aware of it. That's why that self-awareness piece is so useful, because we can tune in quicker. Like, ooh, what's happening for me? all of a sudden I'm feeling shame. Shame just hit me. What happened? Where does that come from? So self-awareness ideally will lead to curiosity instead of judgment, because it can easily go there. It can lead, it can shift into criticism and judgment, but that's not very productive. Curiosity and a wondering of self it helps us to continue to process through and know what's going on for us. So I think for me and my husband, that self-awareness piece was really good actually to like tap into who did we want to be in these moments in our relationship. Like, what was more important? Was it more important to have things, I don't know, because at a certain point I handed it over to him. I was like, you can talk to me if you want to, but I don't feel like you have to tell me all the time, because I feel like I'm being your mother. and I was trying to be aware enough of like, who do I want to be in this relationship? I don't want to be a mother. I already am a mother of others, not you. I didn't marry you to be. So I knew that wasn't good for who I wanted to be. That also created better differentiation. And I think that allowed him to continue to practice his own self-awareness of like, what's going on for me right now, and what do I agree with and what do I disagree with. Like, that was a big part of the shifting of like, actually, I don't think that is bad, or the way that I'm doing it is bad, or the way that we can talk about these things or even explore it as a couple. Like, that is, we were starting to redefine, because we were really tapping into our own selves of like what felt like our path forward together or individually. But that had to start with really tapping into self. So not only does that take paying attention, it takes slowing down, because our lives are so damn busy and we're going and going and going, and our minds are busy, and you mix in anxiety with that and it just makes it even more noisy. So we have to learn how to slow down. We have to learn how to pay attention in small moments that are relevant. And we probably have to deal, like if we have severe anxiety issues, that stuff's going to be real hard. So we have to deal with that too, which I think self-awareness can be part of that type of treatment. But, people that maybe have especially busy or anxiety-ridden brains are really not going to be great at slowing down and paying attention, because they're just needing to worry about the next thing. So yeah, I guess that's what I talk about with self-awareness. There's probably some better stories that I forgot I said in there. With the common humanity piece, again, that's kind of coming from Kristen Neff's self-compassion. She discusses 3 different concepts, and I can't actually remember what all 3 of them are, but the last one was common humanity, which is believing in this idea that we all share humanity imperfectly. Like, we're all in this game where we all experience anxiety. We all experience stress. We all fail and have good days and bad days, and are good parents and bad parents, and all of those things. But it's not just understanding the concept, it's truly believing it that creates that shifting and healing. Again, with vulnerability and empathy, it helps us to tap into that larger idea of common humanity. Because when I went to those groups, it was not only was like, okay, someone gets it, but it was like, I see another human suffering. And so I have proof that I'm not alone anymore, because I'm sitting across from another person who's telling me their story. And so it has a healing quality as well as just a really big bonding quality. I'm sure you felt this in your work. Like, the longer we are therapists, the more you're just like, everyone suffers and everyone has such a hard time. And when someone flips me off when they're driving, I could think of 75 different reasons why their day led them to that behavior. Instead of taking it personally, it's like, no, okay, yeah, I probably did that last week for someone else because of my own reasons. So it increases not only empathy, but like perspective. And that also decreases suffering. And again, that's a mindfulness concept as well, that when we understand everyone is just struggling along, it makes our lives feel a little less like shit shows, if you will.
Right. Yeah, no, I really appreciate that, because I think when I think about, especially like something as shameful as the pornography dilemma, I think there's a lot of shame for both parties typically there. obviously the shame of the male partner, usually that, he's behaving in a certain way that has gone against their initial agreements. He's usually been secretive and just being ashamed of his own sexuality, right? That oftentimes not understanding himself why some of these things are coming up. And then I think the shame oftentimes for the female partner is that of, like you're saying, not being enough. Why was I naive? Why was I stupid enough to believe him? All of those things that can feel, it just goes back to this really yucky sensation of shame. And what is the solution, right? What's the solution? And so I think the solution does come back to these concepts of compassion, of humanity, of understanding how humans work, regardless of what religion we are. I usually like to say our bodies don't know we're Mormon or Catholic or Jewish or atheist. Our bodies don't know that. They're just collecting data and understanding where they are safe and where they're not and why they're not. And oftentimes the reasons why we're not safe is because of potential threat to relationship, right? Threat to relationship. Will I get divorced? Will I get excommunicated? Will I get thrown out of the will of my parents? It's like all of these kinds of ways that we reject each other instead of focusing more on hopefully some level of acceptance. And obviously we need to have boundaries, and not all behavior, quote unquote, goes. But a lot of times I think we're taught to monitor at such a microscopic level that is not really realistic to how most humans function, that I think that's where shame oftentimes develops very easily.
I love how you mentioned the idea of like belonging, or that we're going to get rejected. There's some cool research. Lisa Diamond out of University of Utah has some awesome stuff that is really tapping into what our bodies are somewhat on guard to watch out for risk of rejection, because we need belonging so much. And I agree, like that's its own type of trauma when there is this rejection, whether it's real or imagined. Your body doesn't know the difference. It's still terrified of getting rejected and lacking that sense of belonging. And it's especially ironic because it's such a community that is trying to perpetuate deep belonging within an identity, within a religion, within an eternal life family plan, and yet there is this deep-seated fear around rejection because maybe we won't be accepted anymore. We will not have that belonging.
Well, when belonging is predicated on behavior instead of acceptance, then we're typically going to have an issue.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, because you somewhat have to earn it.
Yeah, right. Instead of just having it be a right, I get to belong because I'm here and because I exist, versus, hustling for your worth, right? I think is the, I think it was Brene Brown who said that, or somebody said that.
Yes.
Who was smarter than me.
And I know there's like arguments that it's like, no, you're accepted anyways, but when you lose a temple recommend and you can no longer, or when there is literal consequences that do not communicate belonging, it's very hard for your body to really believe that you belong. Again, that's where the shame lives then.
Exactly. Right. And I think that's something that all of us need to think about, is what is more important? Is it more important that somebody conforms so that we can be comfortable? Or is it more important that we belong to each other and we can actually live and be? And I think that's a good question for people to sit with, whether that's how you interact with your children, how you interact with certain friendships, whether, extended family. I think it affects a lot of different types of relationships, and even yourself. I think all of us have a pretty, I think many people I know probably have the worst relationship with anybody with themselves, which is why I love Kristen Neff's work, is all that self-compassion stuff, because we talk to ourselves in ways that we would hardly ever think to talk to other people. So
yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, I know that we've come kind of towards the end of our time. So a question I typically ask is there something that you were just burning to tell us all that I didn't ask you about, that you didn't get a chance to say?
Well,
thoughts?
No, I guess some final thoughts. Maybe I'll do a plug, because to all of those that are listening, Natasha has been this incredible pioneer, and I feel like I'm decades behind following your footsteps, and just so in awe of your work, and I'm trying to do a faith transitions group, actually. So if anyone that's listening is interested, like, we're wanting to either do ones in person or virtually. Again, we're kind of still working out the kinks, but since we've been talking about groups, yeah, I would love if there's those interested to kind of seek us out so that we can help with some of those spaces. I know that there's a lot of that in Rexburg, but there's so much secrecy. Some people are still on campus and they still want their jobs or whatever. It's tough to be able to find a safe, protective place to be confused. And so we're really trying to provide that here.
Yeah. And so give kind of an idea of where people can reach you and where they can find out more information.
Yes. So Greenstone Counseling, we're greenstonecounseling.com. That's the website. Again, we're in Rexburg, we're in Picatello. We have a group tab, and that's where they can seek that out. We're actually having an admin meeting today. Right now, there should be a form where people can link to it and fill out some information so we can get them added to our list. I'm not sure if that button is created yet, but it will be soon. So that is something, and we would love to do other groups. We would love to do like an LGBTQ group. We've done a lot of support with Pride events and things like that. But again, it's hard to either find the people and help them find us. Like, we don't have that large of a platform to be able to access who needs us. And we also provide traditional therapy services as well. So that's there too. But I've been working on this group thing for a while, and I just want, it's kind of a baby that I'm hoping will transition into a toddler.
Yeah, right. Well, and I really appreciate that you're all focusing on offering those kinds of services, because I think they're really needed. So yeah, Greenstone Counseling. I know also you're a board member for the Mormon Mental Health Association, which is kind of shortened for MMHA. I'm the founder of that organization. That's another resource for people going through faith transitions, especially in kind of Mormon/LDS land. At the same time, I notice more and more that a lot of us working even from kind of coming from an LDS background, because we are fairly vocal, we get people coming from other religions too. Like, I know my faith transitions group will oftentimes have somebody from Jehovah's Witness or from evangelical land. We've, had some people from Orthodox Judaism join. So, I think people are looking, there's a lot of different things shifting with organized religion, but there aren't so many resources, and people are facing many similar challenges, which oftentimes have to do with community, dismantling shame, reconstructing, lives where there's great meaning and value to their lives. So thank you for doing your work in your corner of the world, which, I think there's a lot of need in both Rexburg and Pocatello. So thank you for all that you're doing. And again, this is the book that Erika has written. It's called Don't Walk Alone, Understanding the Divine Gift of Connection While Navigating Shame. I think it would be a great fit for those who are still active in the church, those who are transitioning. And even, I enjoyed it as, a post member. So thank you for your work and for going through your own journey. And thank you for your time and spending it with us today.
Thanks for having me. Always a pleasure. Very much.
All right. Thank you, Erika. You have a great rest of your night. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional Facebook page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can also find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The information shared on this program is informational and should not be considered therapy. This podcast addresses many topics around mental health and sexuality and may not be suitable for minors. Some topics may elicit a trigger or emotional response, so please care for yourself accordingly. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer Podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes is by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening.
There is a place where time slows and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. Now tishki say the so we can always go to the homeland of the heart. 10,000 years of our human history etched on her canyon walls, alongside Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. Nahotishki so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. Deep in our cities, we sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. Nahotishki so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart.